Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's the CD guy, Johnny Z here. Thank you so much for tuning back into the channel, and today I'm going to be ranking the studio albums of Motorhead from worst to best. You guys voted for it, so let's get started. 23 studio albums here in total. Coming in at number 23, my personal least favorite has got to be On Parole. Released in 1979, but it was initially intended to be the band's debut record, recorded in late 1975, early 1976, but passed on by record labels at the time, and it would finally see the light of day in 1979. Released by United Artists Records without the band's permission following the success of Overkill and Bomber, and Motorhead had since left United Artists and had bounced around to two different labels by the time of this release, and so they distanced themselves from On Parole when it came out, again without their permission, and didn't really consider it to be a true Motorhead album. Most of the material on here would later be re-recorded with the classic Motorhead lineup in 1977 for their self-titled debut, and sounds much better compared to On Parole in my opinion. Really not a fan of the sound on this record, and I can never really get into On Parole, but I couldn't get into it the same way as I could their debut album, and it's cool this is the only album that featured the original Motorhead lineup with drummer Lucas Fox, although most of his parts would end up being overdubbed by Philthy Animal Taylor anyway. Number 22, let's fast forward all the way to 2006 with the release of Kiss of Death. This record kind of followed in a similar direction to Inferno with a heavier sound, working for the second time with producer Cameron Webb, and I think this record is full of solid rock and roll. There's nothing bad on here at all, but with the exception of the classic God Was Never On Your Side, a lot of the material on here is just very unmemorable in my opinion, and that's a problem I think would end up plaguing a lot of the 21st century Motorhead albums from here on out. They're good records, everything you could want and expect from Motorhead, but some of their modern stuff just starts to blend together after a while, and it makes you appreciate standouts like Sucker, great opener on this album, and God Was Never On Your Side even more. Number 21, gonna go with Hammered from 2002. The band didn't go as balls to the wall for this record as they did with We Are Motorhead, and rather this album is, a bit more subdued at times. It's a bit uneven and moody, but this album has a much darker feel to it, and I think Lemmy wrote some really interesting melodies here as well. The record is definitely a little bit all over the place at times, but, I do enjoy the punk influence on a track like Walk a Crooked Mile. That's a great album opener. The band get downright thrashy on Red Raw. That's a really heavy track that, would be a great fit on a record like We Are Motorhead or Inferno. And then, of course, there's the bonus track of The Game, which you're a fan of pro wrestling like myself, you've probably heard to death. Number 20, Snakebite Love from 1998. Motorhead were definitely under the gun for this record. Their third on Steamhammer and the final produced by Howard Benson. And the band have all pretty much described the album's writing process as stressful, and, listening to this record, it definitely feels rushed. I like the material on here, but I think it definitely needed a bit more time to be fleshed out. I like the variety, though, on this record. You have your traditional fast-paced Motorhead with a mix of slower tracks as well. I think 90s Motorhead in general is very underrated. This was a time when the band were putting out a new album like almost every year, and they were just continually flying under the radar, but this is by far my least favorite Motorhead album of the 90s. I think definitely could have benefited from some more time in the studio for sure. Next, at number 19, let's go with The World Is Yours from 2010, an album dedicated to Ronnie James Dio, who died less than a year earlier, and like I said, 21st century Motorhead can kind of blend together, but this one is a definite standout from a production standpoint. It's the band once again working with Cameron Webb, and Webb does a phenomenal job, I think, on this record, and really highlights the energy of the band, which maybe had been renewed out of grief after Dio's death, I'm not really sure, but regardless of the reason, there are some great standout tracks on here that I enjoy, like Born to Lose, I Know How to Die, Get Back in Line. Rock and roll music is great, Waiting for the Snake, Outlaw, so a lot of really solid tracks on here, underrated record here from 2010, great stuff by Motorhead later on in their careers. The band continued to write after The World Is Yours, and the result 3 years later was my number 18 here on the list, Aftershock, another defiant, in-your-face record. Phil Campbell is just on fire here, and this is a definite showcase for him. Motorhead were never really about changing up their sound, but I do really like the 50s blues influence on display throughout, with a mix of, 50s blues, early rock with their distinct heavier sound as well. This record was definitely a throwback of sorts to some of the creative decisions the band had made, say, 25 years earlier. Number 17, Motorizer from 2008. This was a definite step up from Kiss of Death 2 years earlier, and Motorizer is more of what you'd expect from the band, and when it comes to Motorhead, that's never a bad thing. They aren't a band where I want to hear their pop album, and then I want to hear their disco album, and then I want to hear their grunge album, they're not Kiss, is basically what I'm trying to say, you know what I mean, but you get exactly what you expect from Motorhead on Motorizer, and it's a really tight, compact, hard-hitting record. You have 11 tracks on here, and the album clocked in at just under 40 minutes. it's a really efficient album, doesn't lag, and, it was never going to be a massive success for the band in 2008, but it's still packed with killer 21st century Motorhead deep cuts that are all worth a listen. Number 16, Inferno from 2004. Working for the first time here with producer Cameron Webb, brought out the heaviest side of the band that fans had heard in years, and it has this modern sound to it, but it's still rooted in, blues, punk, and heavy metal, but it definitely feels like a more modernized sounding Motorhead record, and it sounds great. You have classics on here, like In the Name of Tragedy, Smiling Like a Killer is fantastic. Some other standouts on this record include, Keys to the Kingdom and The Year of the Wolf, Suicide, Killers, Terminal Show. So there are some great tracks here, and I think working with a different producer after Hammered definitely brought out the best in the band for sure. Number 15, gonna go with Overnight Sensation from 1996, and, it's a rare sight to see the band on the cover here, and with clean-shaven Lemmy and a title like Overnight Sensation, that was bound to scare some people at first, considering the notable changes a lot of metal bands had undergone, pursuing a more commercial sound and look by 1996, but fear not, once you put it on, it's still same old Motorhead, and you can see the lineup here of Lemmy, Mickey D, and Phil Campbell on the cover, back to the trio lineup that would remain for the rest of the band's career. Wurzel had departed the band by this point, and I think his absence is definitely felt on some of the riffs on this record, but otherwise this is a really fun listen. Civil War and Eat the Gun are, some killer rockers, and you have some really great variety here as well, with the use of acoustic guitar on Listen to Your Heart. Very solid record, very underrated mid-90s Motorhead. Number 14, March or Die from 1992, and, sometimes I feel like I'm the only one who really likes this record. This album gets a bad rap, and I kind of understand why. It's sort of a hodgepodge, thrown together record. It's a mixed bag of covers, collaborations, and new original material. Definitely not on the same level as 1916 from a year earlier, but I think it's still full of great stuff, like Stand, Cat Scratch Fever, great cover there, Bad Religion, Jack the Ripper, I Ain't No Nice Guy, classic ballad, Hellraiser, of course, written by Lemmy, performed first by Ozzy on No More Tears, but I prefer Lemmy's version, to Ozzy's version, even though they're both great. Asylum Choir, You Better Run, March or Die, a lot of really great stuff on here. Largely, I think, a very overhated record. Number 13, let's go with the last Motorhead album, Bad Magic, in 2015, released just 4 months before Lemmy's death, and, if you watch live footage from around this time, it's very obvious that Lemmy was really struggling by this point with mounting health issues, but Lemmy gave us everything he had up until the end, even putting out one last really strong record before his death, and there's definitely a feeling of spontaneity on this album, seeing that the band recorded at least 5 of the tracks live in the studio rather than one at a time. It's one of my personal favorite final metal albums of all time, with standouts on here like Victory or Die, Thunder and Lightning, The Devil, Electricity, Evil Eye, Teach Them How to Bleed, The Great, Till the End, awesome ballad, love a good Motorhead ballad here, and it's one of those tracks kind of similar to Lazarus for the Black Star album by David Bowie, kind of in the sense that you don't fully understand the lyrics on it until after Lemmy had passed and after Bowie had passed right with Lazarus. So it definitely takes on a new meaning following Lemmy's death, but great ballad there. Tell Me Who to Kill, Choking on Your Screams, When the Sky Comes Looking for You, great cover of Sympathy for the Devil as well, so fantastic record here, great final album in the Motorhead catalog, just, 4 months before Lemmy would pass away. At number 12, Rock and Roll from 1987, and, as the album's title would suggest, they were Motorhead, and they played rock and roll, as advertised, This album marks the brief reunion of the classic lineup with the return of Philthy Animal Taylor for a few more years before he was fired once again, but he was back in the band at this point, and this is not the band's best record, but still a lot of fun. Not their best songwriting, but the tracks on here are infectious, and it's impossible not to get into songs like, Eat the Rich, Rock and Roll, Blackheart, Stone Deaf in the USA, Dogs, Boogeyman as well. So, some consider it to be one of the band's worst albums, and there are parts that are a bit uninspired, but I still really enjoy it, and like I said, think it's a lot of fun. Number 11, Iron Fist. Maybe an unpopular opinion not to have this in the top 10. Still a really strong record, and the last to feature the lineup of Lemmy, Fast Eddie Clarke, and Philthy Animal, and you have the classic title track here, then you have I'm the Doctor and Go to Hell, but otherwise this album always has, struck me as the weakest from the classic era of the band from a songwriting perspective. Nothing on here is bad by any means, right? Motorhead don't have a bad album, but I think it's definitely a bit front-loaded, and side 2 is definitely dragged down by some filler, throwaway songs, and I'm a fan, but it's just not as strong as, some albums like Overkill, Ace of Spades, or Bomber from the Three Amigos lineup. Breaking into the top 10 here with Another Perfect Day from 1983, released during a really interesting time period for the band. This is their only album to feature lead guitarist Brian Robertson, most notably of Thin Lizzy, and I like his work on this record. I think he was a good fit. He did better work, of course, with Thin Lizzy, but does a good job filling in the large shoes of Fast Eddie Clarke on this record on guitar. And from a production standpoint, this is probably one of the crispest sounding Motorhead records, dare I say a bit commercial at times sounding. It sounds polished. I think Brian Robertson implemented some really interesting melodies here. Some standouts here for me include, Back at the Funny Farm, Storm, Dancing on Your Grave, One Track Mind, one of my favorite Motorhead songs of all time, Marching Off to War, Another Perfect Day, and I Got Mine. Great stuff here, in my opinion. Definitely deserving of a spot in the top 10. Number 9, gonna go with 1995's Sacrifice. Just a scathingly heavy record, arguably Motorhead's heaviest in their catalog. Another example of why I love 90s Motorhead. Lots of great albums released in that decade that not enough people paid attention to at the time, and it's the final album to feature the four-piece lineup of Lemmy, Wurzel, Phil Campbell, and Mikkey D, although Wurzel didn't do much on this record, only a couple solos. That's why the band didn't even bother to show his picture on the back of the album. But some people wouldn't have this in their top 10, but for me personally, I just love how aggressive and heavy this album is, and it's nothing new or particularly different from Motorhead, and just more of that fast-paced, unrelenting sound meant to be cranked up. And lyrically, it's definitely not Lemmy's finest hour here, but there's some great hooks on this record, and I absolutely love tracks on this album like Sacrifice, Over Your Shoulder is great, Dogface Boy is fantastic, even though the lyrics aren't, all that good. Still a really fun song. In Another Time, Out of the Sun, Make 'Em Blind. Some really heavy stuff on here. I really enjoy it a lot, and again, maybe unpopular to have this in the top 10, but like I said before, in my opinion, their heaviest album. Number 8, gonna go with Bastards from 1993, the band's first full-length studio album to feature Mikkey D as a full-time member behind the kit. I really love this lineup of Lemmy, Wurzel, Mikkey, and Phil Campbell, and these four didn't last long enough, but this was absolutely the album that, the band needed to make after the very underrated but still thrown together March or Die from a year earlier. Standouts for me on this album include Burner, Death or Glory, I Am the Sword, Born to Raise Hell, Bad Woman, Liar, then of course Don't Let Daddy Kiss Me, which is a great example of Lemmy's lyrics being, more serious and emotional when they had to be. Number 7, how about We Are Motorhead from 2000? This album does not get talked about enough, in my opinion. Motorhead kicked off the 21st century with one of their most underrated albums, and it's just fantastic stuff. It's heavy, it's tight. There's a familiarity to this record, where it wouldn't sound out of place as a release in the band's classic era. Lemmy himself even believed that this album was, far better than they ever got credit for, and I love it, personally. This is my go-to 21st century Motorhead record here, and love tracks on here like the title track. It's a lot of fun, right? Slow Dance, Stay Out of Jail, great cover of God Save the Queen, Out to Lunch, Wake the Dead, right? Stage Fright, Crash and Burn, Wearing Your Heart on Your Sleeve. So many great songs on here, and, I can't help but feel like the rest of the 2000 catalog starts to blend in after this record, but every Motorhead album, like I said before, ranges from good to great, but this was the last truly great album the band ever made, in my opinion. Number 6, let's go with Bomber. Classic Motorhead on display here. It's an album packed full of classics like the title track, Dead Men Tell No Tales, and Stone Dead Forever, as well as some really great deep cuts on here like Sharpshooter, Lawman, and Step Down. I love how bluesy that song is, and by this time the band were starting to gain traction in both the metal and punk circles, and this record was the perfect follow-up to Overkill, in my opinion, to please fans from, multiple genres. Top 5 here with Orgasmatron. Motorhead went through a little bit of a change here. Now it's a 4-piece lineup instead of a trio. This was the first album to feature the guitar duo of Phil Campbell and Wurzel. Great lineup here, and the only studio album to feature drummer Pete Gill. Prior to this release, the band were dealing with a lot of legal issues, a lot of pent-up frustration that can definitely be heard on this record. A lot of awesome riffs on this album, and it starts off hot with Deaf Forever and just does not let up, with other standouts here being Nothing Up My Sleeve, Ain't My Crime, Riding with the Driver, which I believe was supposed to be the original title for this record. Dr. Rock is great as well. The title track is awesome, produced by Bill Laswell, who I think really added another layer of heaviness to this album, and also worth checking out is Sepultura's epic cover of the title track, which, to be honest, gives the original a run for its money. At number 4, I'm going to go with the debut album, self-titled, from 1977. Legendary debut, even if On Parole was technically recorded first, and due to limited time in the studio, the band decided to re-record most of the material from On Parole. Only Fools and Leaving Here weren't re-recorded, and you have the classic lineup playing on this record of Lemmy, of course, on bass and vocals, Fast Eddie Clarke on lead guitar, and Philthy Animal Taylor on the drums, and this record features far better versions of the tracks that also appear on Parole, which, in my opinion, of course, like I said, my least favorite Motorhead record, but sounds far superior on this record. Plus the addition of White Line Fever, Keep Us on the Road, and a cover of Train Kept a Rollin'. When this came out, nobody sounded like Motorhead, right? Of course, nobody sounded like Lemmy on lead vocals, but the band had a distinct, unmistakable sound to them. Lemmy's bass tone was so distinctive, and the band were just full pedal to the metal here with really raw and aggressive record, with material from a young and hungry band. And production on this album, like with a lot of debuts, is not the best, but it doesn't really matter here in this respect because the tracks are timeless pointless anyway. Top 3 now with Ace of Spades from 1980. Of course, everyone's heard the title track to death, and it doesn't change the fact that it's one of the most recognizable and iconic metal songs of all time. I probably never need to hear it again, but, when I do hear it, it's not like I roll my eyes or anything. And the rest of this record, which kind of exists in the shadow of the massive Ace of Spades, is phenomenal as well, just from top to bottom. I mean, so many great tracks on here, like Love Me Like a Reptile, Shoot You in the Back, Live to Win, We Are the Road Crew, Jailbait, Bite the Bullet, The Chase is Better Than the Catch is awesome, so is The Hammer to close things out. And even though Motorhead never really considered themselves to be a part of the new wave of British heavy metal, this was a crucial record to its rising popularity in the late 70s and early 1980s. For number 2, I'm going to go with 1916, released in 1991, and a lot of people would not have this ranked so high, but it's one of my personal favorites. Again, I love 90s Motorhead, and this is their best offering of the decade in my opinion, and in a year as stacked as 1991 was for rock and metal, this album definitely stands out. And one thing I love the most is the variety on this record. It's not often that Motorhead, change things up and step out of their comfort zone, and largely this is a typical Motorhead album, but the incorporation of ballads like Love Me Forever and the title track, as well as the use of saxophone on Angel City, are really welcome additions on top of the rest of this record, which is some of the strongest material that the band ever made, including some other great tracks on here like The One to Sing the Blues, I'm So Bad Baby I Don't Care, No Voices in the Sky, Going to Brazil, Ramones, Shut You Down. I mean, so many awesome songs on here. This was a pretty diverse album for Motorhead, especially at the time, and the final album featured Philthy Animal Taylor on drums in its entirety. And last but not least, coming in at number 1, this is probably predictable, gotta go with Overkill from 1979, just a perfect album from top to bottom here, one of the best sophomore records in metal history, and one of those genre-defining albums that really helped to birth speed metal. This record was also a major influence on the burgeoning, thrash metal scene that would start to take shape over the next several years, and contrary to the band's debut album, production had improved tenfold on this record as the band worked with Jimmy Miller, who previously worked with Traffic and the Rolling Stones most notably, and this album is, in my opinion, the ultimate representation of the Motorhead sound. It's raw, it's punky, it's a little bit proto-thrash, it's bluesy and rough around the edges, no frills rock and roll. Every song on here is a banger. Some of my personal favorites include Overkill, of course, the title track, which is even better live, Stay Clean, I'll Be Your Sister, Capricorn, No Class, Damage Case, Tear You Down, and Metropolis. So many great songs on here. Overkill, my favorite album from the band, released in 1979. Just, in my opinion, their peak studio work here, and they have a lot of great records. Again, no bad albums, but if I had to pick a best, which, is always hard with a catalog as expansive and vast as Motorhead's, it would have to be Overkill. So, coming in at number 1 here, gotta go with this great sophomore record from 1979. So, that wraps up this ranking here of all 23 studio albums by Motorhead from worst to best. You guys can see my ranking right over here. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel down below, turn on the bell for notifications so you don't miss a new upload. Thank you to everybody who voted for Motorhead as an S ranking on the channel, and Queen did come in second place, so do expect a Queen ranking coming in the next week or so as well, and I'll get to all the bands on that poll at some point, so don't worry about that, but definitely stay tuned for more of these rankings throughout the rest of the year, and please be sure to let me know down in the comment section below what are your thoughts on my list, and what are some of your favorite Motorhead albums of all time. I want to hear from you, and until next time, it's the CD guy, Johnny Z, signing off. Take care, everybody.